Good afternoon. I'm Ina Trotman Jamet. I follow on from Hazel Dabrio, who spoke to you on pregnant women. And preceding her was Denise Tanis, who was one of the main researchers who shared with you on these emerging findings, and then shared her personal experience. So we thank them. I am now going to share with you on women with disabilities. I will be very brief. So let's look at some of the faces of domestic violence. Let's look at some of the global statistics, which also include the Caribbean. We know that 50% of disabled women have experienced domestic violence, and that's compared to 25% of non-disabled women. We also know that women with disabilities are twice as likely to be assaulted or raped as a non-disabled woman. And they're also, understandably, more likely to endure abuse for longer periods because of the lack of available support and also because of their level of dependence. And women who access mental health services, again, those statistics are quite high. Between 50 and 60% of women with disability who accessed mental health services had experienced domestic violence. And currently, at the time of the research, 20% were also being currently abused. And in the Caribbean, from the available prevalent rates, we know that about 4 to 5% of women in the general population experience domestic violence. So what I want to share with you very briefly on this afternoon are some of the emerging findings. Remember that this is a situation where we have only just completed some preliminary analyses, and we're still in the process of doing in-depth analysis. So we are presenting emerging findings for those of you who may have come in after we started. So I want to share briefly with you on experiences of women with disabilities who shared dominating, demeaning, and very violent experiences. Briefly as well, I want to share with you tales of madness, lies, and entrapment that came out of the research. Some of the effects that women with disabilities shared with us, and also the longevity of that experience. And very, very briefly, some of the paradoxes and counter-paradoxes that emerge. So what are some of the dominating, demeaning, and violent experiences that women shared with us across Barbados and Grenada? There were violence of a physical, sexual, and emotional nature. Now you can understand that we're talking about women with disabilities, limited mobility, impaired hearing, no speech, in a wheelchair. So we're talking about significant levels of disabilities. And this is what they shared with us. An example of the physical violence was not only that there were beatings, but there were also threats of killing. Accompanying such threats were the reminder that they would only spend a very, very short time in jail. In their opinion, if they committed permanent harm through death. The sexual violence was unconsenting and coercive. Now, that's not to say that that is not how sexual violence could be for all women, but particularly when you are limited in your mobility or in some of your senses, you can understand the difficulty and the fear and the terror that women with disabilities experience. And these were shared with us, unconsenting and coercive. The emotional violence was something that women talked about constantly. And these forms of violence, ladies and gentlemen, obviously are not mutually exclusive. They coexist with each other, don't they? You are going to have emotional violence if you have physical violence. You are going to have emotional violence if you have sexual violence. But some of the specific emotional violence that people shared with us were the insults, name-calling, the denigration, being put down because of the type of disability they had. Nobody will want you because of A, B, and C. You are in a wheelchair, you can't speak. So being put down, being denigrated because of the type of disability they had. And in all cases, this was intentional. We have the case of a blind interviewee who talked about her things being constantly moved, the radio being turned off when she was listening to it, deprivation of the senses, deprivation of hearing, and deprivation, if you like, of touch. Because if your things are being moved and you have to search for them, you have to touch many things before you can find them. So a powerful form of violence here in the case of this blind interviewee who always had her things move deliberately to cause her frustration, to cause her anger, to cause her upset. Others said, I could not take someone being constantly saying to me that you are blind. You are blind. And this interviewee repeated it to emphasize not only the intentional nature of that reminder of her disability, but also in conveying it in that way. She was saying to me, it hurts, and it hurts very badly. That she would be cursed daily. There are also tales of madness. There are also tales of lies. And of course, women with disabilities felt completely entrapped. One said, when I told him that I would expose him and tell everyone that he is abusing me, he told me that I would tell everyone that you're mad. The age-old control strategy used by usually people we love or people who say they love us. And this interviewee said that was the beginning of the campaign to make every one believed that I was mad. And this was a lady who had a stroke. Another spoke of deliberate and painful lies, of having conditions that she did not have. And this extended to her workplace, that untruth being also shared with her work colleagues. Being locked indoors and unable to get out. Persons, we know the effect that that would have on us. Imagine the situation of being blind, of being in a wheelchair, and being physically locked indoors deliberately with no means of escape. Women shared with us some of the effects of this, and they talk of embodied experiences from the abuse. They talk about feeling weak all the time, having headaches, not being able to sleep, and the fact that oftentimes it got too much for them. Another effect is that people shared that they felt so helpless because they had to rely totally on their partner to take them everywhere. They had lost their independence. People talk about wanting to commit suicide because they felt trapped, because of the forms of violence that they were experiencing. I felt trapped in every way, and I was devastated to the extent that I felt I wanted to commit suicide. And this feeling was echoed by someone else who said, honestly, these were her words, honestly, I will be honest, a couple of times I wanted to commit suicide, but she thought of other people. But I thought about how it would affect my mother. And I said, I don't want to put her through this. I don't want to put my mother through the pain of her daughter committing suicide. And someone said, I believe that a lot of young ladies feel like this when they go through abuse. They look to commit suicide because there isn't anyone who really understand the pain you're going through. Then he spoke about the longevity of the experiences of women's abuse, the relentlessness of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. And this was often of a serial nature. They were all abusive to me. From when I was 19 years until now, and he's still abusive. And this is from a 27-year-old who is blind and who has 2 sons under the age of 5. 28 years, the duration of this interviewee's marriage. She has suffered a stroke. She has a grown-up son and daughter. And arguably, as children, they would have experienced some of this abuse. So as children, they shared with us, I guess I grew up with domestic violence. I only knew that my father used to beat my mother, and if we cried, he'd beat us too. It came to the point that you actually got used to it. The times he used to beat her, I would be crying and say, "Don't let my mother die." My father was so violent, the police was called regularly. They came, took away his cutlass. It was traumatic. He would sit at the back door and sharpen his cutlass and mumble. Now we can only surmise what that mumbling was about. I would theorize that he might have been mumbling maybe about some of the experiences that he was reliving from his childhood. But women were incredibly resilient. Some were able to get out of the situation. There were some people who had help and others who didn't. My cousin came to the church one day. She stopped the service. She told everyone what was going on in church, stopping the pastor from speaking. And that was a breakthrough for this lady. People also talk about their faith in God. Some of the paradoxes, as I said, some people had help, others didn't. The intimate partner relationships varied from initial support. As Hazel said, no one said, "I love you, be my partner, be my wife. But remember, I'm going to share some licks," as they would say in Barbados. No one says that. Women's faith was also very important to them. Having said what I just said about the church, there were others who found that the church was very, very helpful. But again, one woman said, "Well, I told the church, and it seems as though you really can't speak out because I spoke about my abusing husband, and he seemed to be going higher in the church." And the legal responses were very varied. Sometimes it was helpful, sometimes it was not. Some lawyers understood the pain and the violence, others did not. One lawyer told one of her interviewees, "Your husband said he's sorry, so forgive him. Forgive him, man, forgive him." Of course, the violence continued. And finally, is it a deliberate choice? It is, isn't it? It is targeted, and it's under the control of the abuser. Because in most cases, the abuser is not violent with other people. They're not violent with their neighbor. They are not violent with their boss or their best friend. In most cases, the abuser is also able to stop and pull themselves together when someone knocks at the door, particularly if it's the policeman. And when using physical violence, the abuser is often able to choose where to land the blow. The abuser also really damages their possessions. Finally, the WHO reminds us that the number of people with disability is growing due to the aging population. due to the global increase in chronic health conditions associated with disabilities such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and mental illness. This is our profile in the Caribbean. So we're all potentially vulnerable. I thank you.